I suppose most preachers will be preaching on the gospel today, Jesus in the desert. And I've done that, of course. But this week, something else caught me. The question of why the church gives us this first reading for the first Sunday of Lent. Because it really doesn't seem to have anything in it about Lent. So I'd like to start there. It's a description of how the Israelites should bring their tithe to the Lord. And what I like about this is that the connection between the tithe and the reason for tithing is very clear. So Moses tells them when they bring their tithe, he even tells them what to say. And basically, what they're doing is telling the story of what God did for Israel in the desert and in Egypt. And it points out that the reason Israel tithes is directly related to what God did for them. Basically, this is the way that Israel gave thanks to God, is by telling the story, right, of what God did for them. And it's really not that odd. We do this ourselves. I'll get notes sometimes saying, Father, the family is talking about how our mother's funeral went or something, and it was 2 years ago. But they remember it, and they tell me when they want to say thank you, and I've done it myself. I've written people. Not too long ago, I wrote one of my old professors. And as I still remember this that you did for me, blah, 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 So a lot of times we thank people by telling the story of what they did for us. And the time for Israel to do that, there were a couple ways he did it. First was, the premier way was at Passover. That was the celebration of Passover. And even today, observant, more conservative Jews, when they celebrate it, will celebrate Passover in the old way. The youngest, usually boy, will say to the eldest, why is this night different from all other nights? And then the eldest will tell the story of what happened, what God did to Israel in Egypt. The second way was to tithe, as we read here. And notice the difference between how we do it. First of all, most Catholics still don't have it in mind, a real tithe. But even what they give is connected more. Think how we talk about it. We talk about giving to the church, or giving to charity, or we don't talk about giving to God. And so often, although it's been a good thing, when the Finance Council first suggested that we do the offertory we give the option of electronic transfer, I saw the benefits of it. The church certainly has benefited, and people say that they prefer doing it that way. But I said at the time, and I've always been ambivalent about it, it just removes it one more step from the connection that what we're doing is giving to God. And 2 steps from why we're giving it to God. And so now we have our offertory taken automatically out of our bank account, like our gas and electric bill and our phone bill and our house payment. And it's just another bill, and we, like any good business, send a quarterly statement about it, But originally, that's not what the tithing was. It was a remembrance, a way to thank God for what God did, and then we would call that to mind. And it came out of what God gave to Israel. And so he brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand and outstretched arm, with terrifying power, signs and wonders. He gave us this land flowing with milk and honey. And then notice the next word, therefore. Because God did all this, I now bring you the first fruits of the product of the soil, which you, O Lord, have given me. I remember some years ago, I forget why now, if it was a special kind of apple or I found a good sale or something at this farmer's market. But I brought a basket of apples to a friend of mine and gave them to her. And 2 days later, I got a knock on the door, and I opened it, and she was there with an apple pie in her hand. And it's that kind of idea. She couldn't have thanked me better for those apples than bake me a pie. And if you really want to think of tithing, it seems to me that's a good way to think about it. God has given all this, and now we're giving some back to God. And it's fine to give to charity. It's fine to give to the church. But what the tithing is really about is what we're giving to God from what God has given to us. And I still write out my check for my offertory. It's not just because I'm old and set in my ways, but I like that connection. And I try to remember as I'm writing it out to thank God and to make some connection. Maybe thank God for particular blessings, or just thank God for everything, but I try to make that connection. This is what I'm giving back to you, God, out of what you've given me. And the thing that upset God, we hear this and read it in different places in the Old Testament, is when Israel forgot. For instance, one of the Psalms says, "Fathers, tell your children so that a people yet unborn may know what God has done." Psalm 78, how often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. They tested him again and again and provoked the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember his power or the day when he redeemed them from the foe. They did not remember when he wrought his signs in Egypt and his miracles in the fields of Zoan. To not remember was a great offense against God. And we still have a tendency to do that. And so why about Lent? What does this have to do with Lent? The real purpose of Lent, I know we talk about praying, fasting, all these things in Lent. But the whole purpose of Lent, really, the main purpose of Lent, is to prepare us to celebrate Easter. Holy Week, I should say, really is better. And what do we do on Holy Week? Holy Thursday, we remember the institution of the Eucharist. Friday, we remember Christ's death. Saturday, we remember being without him. Easter Saturday night into Sunday, we remember Christ's resurrection. We remember. It's what we do at every Mass. We call this Eucharist, right? It's one of the names for it, which means thanksgiving. And how do we give thanks? A big part of why we give thanks is that we remember what Christ did. We remember what God does. Pay particular attention. At the preface, we do the preface dialogue, the Lord be with you and with your spirit. Then the preface, of course, it changes all the time. But the preface talks about some aspect of God or something God did. And then in the Eucharistic prayer itself, you notice, if the priest is paying attention, he will not look at you during the Eucharistic prayer because it's not prayed to you. It's me praying to God on all our behalf, you know. And so it's directed at God, and so we talk about what God did or what Christ did. Why? Because God doesn't know what Christ did? Of course he does. It's for us to remember and to tell the story. And so, specifically, the institution narrative, you know. The night before supper, Jesus took bread and he said this, and he took wine and he said this. He did this. That's what the point of all this is, to tell the story. That's how Israel gave thanks, and that's how we give thanks. Is by telling this story again. Not for God's sake, but for us. One of the prefaces says, you have no need of our thanks, yet our desire to thank you is itself your gift. God gives us this to remember for our good. And so it seems to me, in a way, it reminds us that Lent is a time of remembering Christ's suffering and death so that we can really celebrate Easter well. And one way to do that is not just do it at one time of the year, but really, as we worship, to realize part of this is Thanksgiving. And when we give our tithe, is to remember that this is not something we need to keep the lights on at the church or pay our teachers. This is what I'm giving to God. And as you decide what to tithe, it's to, like, this is, God has given me everything. Now what am I going to give back to God, you know? Yes, it comes to the church, but not always. But in Lent is just a particular time, it seems like, to really intensify what we do throughout the year, throughout our lives, for that matter. And it seems to me that if we remember well, we'll celebrate well, we'll thank God more sincerely, more deeply, and that alone should bring us closer to God.